It's great to be back for another class. This week's Torah portion. We begin a new book in the Torah, the third book, the book of Leviticus, Vayikra, the third book. And we're actually going to be focusing on not just the first Torah portion, which is this week's Torah portion, and not just the first reading or the first verse. We will be focusing on the first word in today's class. And the first word is very, very important and very unique. It's unique in that the Talmud tells us that the Hebrew language and in the Torah, the way it's written in the Torah, it is written in three sizes. There's small, the medium, and the large. Most letters in the Torah scroll are written with the medium letters. There are various letters throughout the Torah and the prophets and the scriptures that are written with the large letters and the small letters. And I'll show you an example. I will pull it up on the screen. There we go. If you can see that screen, that's a picture. It says Vayikra in the Hebrew. We have the Vav, the Yud, the Kuf, the Resh. Those are all the medium size. And then we have that Aleph, which seems to be hanging off the top of the line. It's really disproportionate to the rest of the letters. And this is the first word of the book of Leviticus where the Aleph is very small. And so the question obviously is, why such a small Aleph? What can that teach us about life? Because isn't that the purpose of Torah? The Hebrew word of Torah means lessons, to teach us ways of life. And so if there's a small letter there, it must be there for a purpose. And the question is, what is that purpose? What can that be teaching us? And the truth is, analyzing this Aleph and this uniqueness in the verse and in other verses will give us an insight into a very, very powerful question. And that is, where are we supposed to be on the spectrum of self-awareness, self-worth, self-value? Are we supposed to have extreme humility and be the pushover, be someone who perceives himself as a nothing? Or are we supposed to be on the other extreme, someone who walks around with tremendous self-worth and self-value, which leads one to arrogance and haughtiness? Or is there a happy medium? Or is the happy medium a wrong thing because then we're just the run-of-the-mill typical Joe? Is that something that we should strive to be? Is that where it should be at? And this Aleph will actually teach us that idea, give us an insight in the Torah's perspective of what that is. So we'll begin from the beginning of this week's Torah portion, the first verse in this week's Torah portion. There we go. There we go. The first verse of this week's Torah portion, which will give us an understanding on how we should perceive ourselves and what's the correct balance. Text 1. If you have the book in front of you, the page is 161. And he called to Moses, and God spoke to him from the tent of meeting, saying. That's the first word of the book of Leviticus. It's almost an introductory verse. It's God calling to Moses, Vayikra, and he called. So the Hebrew word Vayikra means that he called, and it has that small aleph, as we saw in the Torah scroll. And this question that we asked, why is it small and what does it teach us, is raised by many, many of the sages. And we will quote from one famous 15th century sage, Rabbi Avram Saba, in his book, Tzrar Hamor. And Rabbi Avram Saba explains as follows. The reason for the small aleph in the first word of the verse of this week's Torah portion, perhaps the reason for the small aleph is in line with what I wrote previously. Namely, that out of his great humility, Moses distanced himself from any sort of prestige. He fled from the stage so much that God had to call out to him. Thus, the aleph of the word Vayikra, and he called, is small. When did this author explain previously about Moses' great humility? That was earlier when Moses was tasked with taking the Jews out of Egypt. God appeared to Moses at the burning bush while Moses was tending to the sheep of his father-in-law. And he heard God calling him from the burning bush. He turned to the burning bush and God said, let my people go. Go tell that to Pharaoh. And what did Moses respond? He didn't right away say, all right, God, I'm on my way. What did Moses say? Here's the quote from the book of Exodus, just a few weeks ago. And now, behold, the cry of the children of Israel has come to me. God is telling Moses at the burning bush. And I have also seen the oppression that the Egyptians are oppressing them. So now come, and I will send you to Pharaoh and take my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. Moses, I'm hiring you to be the one. And Moses says to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and that I should take the children of Israel out of Egypt? In Yiddish, we say, wer bin ich? This question we sometimes ask about other people. Who does he think he is? Who does he think he is to tell me what to do? Who does he think he is to give me his opinion? Here, Moses was saying about himself. Who do you think I am? I'm a nobody. They say the story where a rabbi comes to the synagogue on just before Yom Kippur, and the rabbi, in a show of humility, in a great show of humility, goes to the ark just before the prayers. He opens the ark, he prostrates himself on the floor, and he's crying to the Almighty and says, God Almighty, before you, I'm a nobody. I'm a nobody before you. Please accept my entreaty and do it for the sake of your children of Israel and not for me because I'm a nobody. The cantor follows suit and he opens the ark and he prostrates himself on the floor and he says, God, please, I'm a nobody. Really, didn't intend to do anything against you, and really, I'm really insignificant. I'm a nobody. In a show of humility. Little Shmerel sitting in the last line of the synagogue sees the rabbi do it, the cantor do it. He walks straight up to the ark. He opens the ark. He prostrates himself on the floor, and he starts screaming the same thing. I'm a nobody. The cantor turns to the rabbi and says, who does Shmerel think he is, that he's also nobody? So when it comes to humility, seemingly Moses was the biggest nobody. He was the biggest one to have humility. He had true humility. And that is what the little letter Aleph is telling us. The little letter Aleph is telling us that Moses had tremendous humility, as we just read from Rabbi Avram Saba in text 3, that Moses had extreme humility. So what do we have? We have this quote, and we have this idea, and now we know what the little Aleph teaches us. It teaches us all that we have to work on our humility. So technically, we're done. We're done for the class. We can wrap up the class, and we can all go to sleep feeling good about ourselves. So we got some inspiration. But no, we have an hour to fill. So now there's more to that. What does this humility teach us? If a small Aleph teaches us humility, then what would we say about a large Aleph? In other words, not just something which is proportionate to the rest of the Torah. If a small Aleph, which is smaller than the size of the average letter of the Torah, teaches us that we should be humility, what would you say about an oversized Aleph? Also in the Torah, in the original script of the Torah, which would be an oversized, much larger than the average letter. Does that Aleph teach us to be arrogant? Does that Aleph teach us about the individual it is set upon, that he was arrogant? We got to follow the same line of reasoning. And as a matter of fact, in the book of Chronicles 1, there's a verse. It's not just any verse. It's the first word of the first verse, the first letter. Here's the text. Adam, Shais, Enosh. In the book of Chronicles, it tells us the order from Adam until throughout all the generations, who they were. And the first word is Adam, Adam. And as you see over here in the original Hebrew, in the script as it's written in a scroll, the tradition is that the Aleph is an oversized Aleph. Was Adam arrogant? Was he haughty? Is he teaching us to be arrogant? If a small Aleph means to be humble, then what does a large Aleph teach us? And how can they both be teaching us something that we should practice simultaneously? And so this question is not just us asking it. This question came up in a very interesting story that's related by the previous Rebbe. The story is one of the first Chabad Rebbe, Rabbi Shner Zalman of Liadi, who passed in 1813, and his grandson, Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson, the first one, known by his book, the Tzemach Tzedek, who passed away in 1866. And when he was a little child, Menachem Mendel, Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson, first one, the Rebbe's namesake, when he was a young child, he spent a lot of time with his grandfather. And a lot of those conversations that he had with his grandfather were recorded for posterity as they were related to their great-grandson, Rabbi Yosef Yitzchok Schneerson. And here's one story related to our topic. Text 5 on page 164. The previous Rebbe, Rabbi Yosef Yitzchok Schneerson, once described at a Pesach Farbrengen, Passover gathering, how the Alter Rebbe, Rabbi Shner Zalman of Liadi, brought his grandson, the Tzemach Tzedek, to school when the latter was a small boy. The Alter Rebbe instructed the teacher to begin studying the book of Vayikra, of Leviticus. After his first lesson with his teacher, the young boy asked his grandfather, why is the aleph of the word Vayikra small? Small child, a very simplistic, pure question. But the answer is anything but. The Alter Rebbe entered into a spiritual trance for a short while and said, Adam was God's literal handiwork, about whom God testified that he was wiser than the angels. Adam was aware of his own worth, and that eventually got to him, ultimately leading to his downfall with the sin of the tree of knowledge. Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses, our teacher, he too was aware of his own worth. But not only did it not go to his head, the very opposite happened. It caused him to be extremely broken and humble, as he thought that if another Jew, not Amram's son and the seventh scion from Abraham, which he was, would have possessed a soul as lofty as his and a pedigree like his, that person would have certainly outdone him. When God gave the letters at Mount Sinai, they came in three sizes: small, medium, and large. The Torah is written with medium-sized letters, conveying the message that a person ought to be a Beinoni, an in-betweener, which he or she can achieve by studying Torah. Whereas Adam stumbled into sin by dint of his excessive sense of self-worth, the aleph of his name appears in large typeset. Whereas by contrast, Moses achieved the greatest levels of humility by focusing on his unworthiness, so the aleph associated with him is small. A very moving description of a tender moment between a grandfather and a grandson. The grandfather a tzaddik, and the grandson a future Rebbe, leader of the Jewish people. But the question is an obvious question. The Tzemach Tzedek was a young boy. He had just begun learning scripture. As a matter of fact, it was his first study of scripture was the beginning of the book of Leviticus. He had no idea what was written in Chronicles that he will learn in years to come. Why was it important for his grandfather to make that contrast to this young boy? Why couldn't he just answer straightforward, you know why there's a small aleph? To teach us about humility. Simple. Why mention something from Chronicles? And even if you say it was important to mention that aspect from Chronicles, we're talking about disparaging Adam. This doesn't seem to be putting Adam in a positive light. It seems to be saying Adam was mistaken. He was arrogant, and therefore that arrogance led him to the sin of the tree. We studied in the past how important it is and how careful the Torah, the great lengths that Torah goes, not to say anything disparaging even about animals. How much more so when we're talking about something which is the literal handiwork of God, Adam, the first person. Why would the Alter Rebbe speak disparagingly about Adam? And we'll take it a step further. As a matter of fact, there are various explanations on why the Aleph of Adam's name is large. One is true, what the Alter Rebbe quoted to his grandson, that it's to show us that he got carried away. Seems his self-worth got to his head. And therefore he was slightly arrogant, and then he went against God. But there are various other commentaries that explain the exact opposite, that the reason why there's a large Aleph is precisely because of Adam's greatness. For example, we have the Alter Rebbe himself. In his commentary on the Torah, the Alter Rebbe himself explains it in that light. Text 7. Or before we get to the Alter Rebbe, text 6 of an earlier commentator and from the 13th century, who also explains it in a positive light. There's a small aleph in the word Vayikra to teach us that, though God personally called him and afforded him all this honor to constantly speak with him, Moses nevertheless was always humble before God and the Jewish people. The aleph of Adam's name is big to teach us that there was no greater person, either in a physical sense, for he was exceedingly tall, or in the sense of his superior wisdom, which he demonstrated when he gave names to all the animals. Perfect example of the Aleph is something positive. And the Alter Rebbe himself in text 7, in his book, the Likutei Torah, also explains it in a positive light. In Chronicles, Adam's name is written with a large Aleph, a reference to Adam's stature prior to the sin with the tree of knowledge. At that point, he was at an extremely lofty level. And so if the Alter Rebbe himself recognizes that there is a positive way to understand this large Aleph, why would he choose to contradict himself when he's talking to his grandson, opting to interpret it in a seemingly disparaging way about Adam? The short answer is that the Alter Rebbe wasn't merely answering a question. He wasn't answering this simple question, why is there a small Aleph? When his grandson asked him, why is there the small Aleph? The Alter Rebbe saw this as an opportunity to teach his grandson a larger life lesson. And that was in order to appreciate the greatness of the small Aleph, to understand how unique and special Moses' humility was, and the lesson we can glean from it, we first have to understand what the large Aleph means and what lesson we can glean from that. Once we understand and can relate to the large Aleph, then we can go ahead and discuss and derive a lesson from the small Aleph. What do we mean by that? When the Alter Rebbe chose to speak about Adam, he wasn't just choosing to speak about history's mistakes, right? Life's too short to make all the mistakes yourself. Here's a mistake that Adam made. Don't make that mistake. He wasn't teaching that to his grandson. What was he telling his grandson? He's telling his grandson that you, my grandson, and really all of us, we have to emulate Adam. We have to be just like Adam, or at least like Adam the way he was at the beginning of history, who thought highly of his own lofty status. To understand our self-worth, we have to recognize our own self-worth, our own self-value, the qualities that we uniquely have, and that recognition of our own qualities is a tremendous thing. It's an important thing. It's very, very positive. Because only if we recognize the unique qualities that we have over others, or different than others, not necessarily better or worse, but worse, but how special we are, the uniqueness that we are. Only then can we utilize them in the best possible way. The words of the previous Rebbe, Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak Schneerson. Text 8. Everyone should learn how to utilize their own positive qualities, just as one ought to know his or her own shortcomings. So too should he or she know the positive qualities they possess. Learning from Adam's life story is just as important as learning from Moshe's life. Moshe teaches us a thing or two about humility. Right? Here's Moshe, he spoke to God, Moses spoke to God, as the verse tells us, face to face, whatever that means. Greatest level. No one was like him before him, no one will be like him after him. And nonetheless, Moses was the most humble person that ever lived. The verse tells us. God says he is the most humble person that ever lived and ever will. Why was he humble? Because Moses' perception was, I'm only special because God decided to choose me to do and carry this out. God gave me those qualities. And I have a tremendous pedigree. But had God given this pedigree to someone else and given these qualities to someone else, they would have done a much better job. So I can take credit for any of it. Moses was the most humble person, and there's a lot to learn from him. But you know what? There's a lot to learn from Adam as well. What's there to learn from Adam? To learn from Adam that we have tremendous pedigree. We ourselves have tremendous importance. We have tremendous qualities, unique qualities that we have to utilize and accomplish with those qualities. We have to understand that self-worth and understand that we have this self-worth that no one else has. Each one of us individually, something unique. We have qualities. What are those? What's that pedigree that we each have? Each one of us has tremendous pedigree. Yes, we may have historical, whether we went to college and we got degrees from illustrious colleges, whatever it may be. We have the history, we have experience, but there's something deeper. And that is, as a Jew, we possess pedigree, that we were chosen by God to have this unique responsibility and unique relationship with the Almighty by possessing a godly soul. There's nothing greater than that. A unique divine soul within each one of us. Even more than that, each one of us has tremendous pedigree. We all come from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Such tremendous, illustrious ancestors. And so when we think about it in that way, from that perspective, understanding our self-worth, understanding our qualities and that we have, understanding what God has tasked us with, that pride, that feeling of self-worth should be able to carry us to fulfill everything that we need to do and give us that tremendous self-pride. In the words of the Rebbe, every Jew possesses tremendous worth, and as such, any Jew can readily see his or her self-worth. After all, a devout Jew's true value flows from a holy and godly source. And as such, there is no concern that such thoughts of self-worth would ever lead to negative consequences. What's more, a person must have this sense of self-worth, so much so that at times it is the only way to overcome the challenges of the mundane and material reality around us. When a Jew approaches his or her life with a proud and strong stance that flows from holiness, akin to a tzaddik, all challenges dissipate. When we have that understanding, we recognize the tremendous worth that each one of us has, that empowers us to accomplish anything. That gives us the strength necessary. And not only self-worth, but also what contributes to that self-worth, that idea of this pedigree each have that Moses would mention. Perhaps a good example of this idea is a encounter that the Rebbe, the famous philanthropist George Rohr had with the Rebbe. I'll show you the video in a moment. There were a number of times that the Rebbe would meet people one-on-one. Up until 1978, roughly 1977, 78, the Rebbe would meet people for private audiences. 3 times a week, all-nighters. It would begin, say, 8 o'clock at night, and it would go sometimes till 6, 7 in the morning. People would have private audiences with the Rebbe. Whoever called up and arranged an audience would have one. Men, women, children, important people, regular people, it made no difference. In 1986, the Rebbe started giving out dollars, and that was Sunday afternoons. The Rebbe would stand sometimes for 2, sometimes up to 6 hours, handing out dollars and blessings to anyone who would come by. Short meetings, 5 seconds, 10 seconds, it was very quick. But then there was something, it was a meeting, kind of public-private audiences is what they were called, and they there was a funds, and the donors to the funds, the Rebbe would come and speak to them, the Machane Yisrael Fund. And at the end of the speech, then the Rebbe would speak to them. Each person or couple would have a chance to walk over to the Rebbe's table and ask for a blessing. And so this is a video of Mr. George Rohr telling over such a about such a meeting, and a video of that meeting. And listen closely to what the Rebbe tells the Rohr couple.
Moved to New York and got married. I started a beginner's minyan at our shul here in Manhattan. It was basically an introductory service for Jewish adults that may or may not have had the benefit of a Jewish education. We launched it on Rosh Hashanah because we thought that was an auspicious time to try and attract people and so forth. And I was leading it with not a great deal of preparation, but nevertheless I did my best to lead it. And it turned out to have been a success. I remember, as I always did every year, going to visit the Rebbe for Leikach between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. And always long lines. Leikach time was no exception, and you could see people coming to him and expressing their own needs and their own worries and requests for advice, requests for blessings and so forth. Everybody asking and asking and asking the Rebbe for things. I thought to myself, this year I'm going to be different. I'm going to give the Rebbe some nachas. I'm going to give him some good news and make him happy and proud and smile and especially make him proud of me.
I'd like to let the Rebbe know, I hope he has some nachas from the following. This Rosh Hashanah in our shul, I started a minyan for beginners who don't know anything. We had 200 people. 200. On Rosh Hashanah, and Yetz Hashem for Yom Kippur we'll have also. And the Shabbos, we started the first regular Shabbos, we had about 50 people. Last Shabbos. People without any background to start learning a little bit about Yiddishkeit. And I'd like the Rebbe's bracha that we should continue.
And I expected a big yasher koach from the Rebbe. I expected the Rebbe to give me a high five and to congratulate me and so forth. When I said the words Jews without any Jewish background, the Rebbe's smile disappeared. And he looked at me with his piercing blue eyes, and I knew that I had said something very, very wrong. And I didn't know what.
He'll explain to all these people they have a real background of Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yankee. And so the Rivke Rochel the Leah. That's for you, and that's for the people who have no background.
The Rebbe was saying, this is royalty you're talking about. These aren't Jews without any background. This is royalty. And that was the Rebbe for every Jew. For the Rebbe was royalty.
You know,
What was the Rebbe telling Mr. George Rohr? The Rebbe was telling George Rohr something very simple. By default, every single Jew has tremendous background, has tremendous pedigree. Every single Jew comes from Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah. And that's all they need to give them that pride, to give them that strong feeling of self-worth to accomplish anything. You know, Rabbi Kunin, when he first came to California, talking about Jewish pride and that understanding of self-worth. When he first came to California, he, looking like he did with a long flowing beard and unabashedly Jewish, proudly so, out in the open with his tzitzis, he looked the part. And the established Jewish community here wasn't so happy about that. They were very much more comfortable with the Jews who didn't necessarily stick out like a sore thumb, the Jews who didn't necessarily look different than anyone else, and they were not happy with it. And they told him as much that he should tone it down a little bit and he should stop looking so different. And so at a board meeting, Rabbi Kunin arrived and announced to the people of the board meeting, and he said, listen, this is what I'm going to tell you. I am like a train that's racing down the track at 70 miles per hour. You have three choices. You can either jump on the train, you can either move out of the way, or you can get run over. And he walked out. What was he telling them? This exact idea. We have pride. We are unabashedly Jewish. We are proudly Jewish, and we have to stick with our tradition, with that pride, with that understanding of our self-worth. We are the children of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We have self-worth because of this relationship that we have, this unique relationship with the Almighty, with our neshama. And where do we get this understanding of how to use our self-worth to build up our pride? From Adam, from the big Aleph, from the idea that he understood how great he was because he was God's handiwork. So if it's so great to have such Jewish pride, and we learn that from Adam, and we take a page out of Adam's book, then what's the issue? What's the issue that the Alter Rebbe was telling his grandson about Adam? The issue was that there's an inherent risk involved. And that is, if we focus exclusively on this unique powers that we are given, and that's the only thing that matters to us, is our inherent self-worth, then it can very easily lead us, just like it did Adam, to the sin of the tree of knowledge. It can lead us to let that self-worth get to our head and not just lead us to powerful action. It can lead us to get to our head. So we should take a page out of Adam's playbook and follow the way he began with understanding his self-worth. And so we have to understand our self-worth. We have to understand the unique powers that we are given, and that is that we each possess an neshama to conquer whatever challenges may come our way. But before we let it get to our head, before we let things get out of hand and lead to the sin of knowledge, we got to move over to Moses' playbook. We have to take Moshe's message to understand that, yes, we have these tremendous ideas. Yes, we have this tremendous pedigree, and we have this tremendous power that's given us by the divine. But it's just that. It's given to us by the divine. We have to take a page out of Moses' book to understand that level of humility that we ought to have, together with a healthy self-value and self-worth. In the words of the Rebbe, text 10, page 168. While in a state of holy pride and being cognizant of our own self-worth, we must be vigilant that our personal egos never get involved. Not only must we be aware of our own shortcomings, we must go to the opposite extreme. A radical sense of humility and selflessness. It is here that we see Moses' tremendous humility, so much so that it served as the antidote to the sin of the tree of knowledge. According to tradition, the stain of the primeval sin was removed at Matan Torah, when Moses received the Torah at Mount Sinai. Moses wasn't just a humble person. He was the most humble man on the face of the earth, quoting a verse. He would measure himself up against every other person and conclude that if that person would have my qualities, he or she would have certainly surpassed me. So, of course, Moses knew the special powers that were given to him by God. And that's what gave him the courage to confront Moses, to confront Pharaoh, and redeem the Jewish people along with all the other great things that he achieved. But Moses added a dimension to his self-perception. When he compared himself to others, he believed that other people would have done a better job than he did. Were they given the same opportunities that he did? And that humility is what kept his self-worth in check. It's what kept his self-worth with the right perspective, enabling it to be a continuous engine of positivity, a continuous engine of accomplishment and of changing the world. And so what's the takeaway for us? What do we take? Are we supposed to be like Adam? Are we supposed to be like Moses? Or are we supposed to be like neither of them or like both of them? How does that work? And the reality is that the Talmud tells us that we each possess strain of Adam and Moses within ourselves. Here's a quote from the Talmud, text 11. And you, my sheep, the sheep of my pasture, are Adam. A verse from Ezekiel. Says the Talmud, you, the Jewish people, are called Adam. We're all called Adam, and as explained by the Alter Rebbe, who explains this concept in the Tanya, every soul that has ever lived on earth was once part of Adam Harishon, Adam, the first being. Generally speaking, Adam's soul splits into 613 strains, but more specifically, it splits into innumerable sparks, which are the souls of every Jew from the beginning of time until the end of days. And so we have an Adam strain within us, but we don't just stop at that, because just as we each possess an Adam strain, we each possess a Moses strain as well. As the Alter Rebbe in Tanya explains as well, every Jewish soul possesses a dimension of Moses, for he was one of the 7 shepherds who transmitted godly energy to the umbrella of the Jewish soul, which is the very reason they are called shepherds. Moses was the ultimate shepherd, called the faithful shepherd in the Zohar. So as the Alter Rebbe begins with, every Jewish soul possesses a dimension of Moses. We each have within us a Moses strain as an Adam strain and an Adam strain. And because we possess both in our very spiritual DNA, a strain of Moses and a strain of Adam, we got to activate both those strains. We got to activate the Adam strain as powerful as possible. We got to turn up the knob of our pride, of who we are, understanding our self-worth, understanding the unique capabilities that the divine has given within us. Our soul gives us that strength to do whatever it takes, to overpower whatever we need overpowering with, especially in the area of Torah and mitzvahs. We have to go with that sense of pride. You know who my grandfather is? He's Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. You know, my grandmother is Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, Leah. You know who I am? I am someone who has a soul, a veritable part of the divine, of godliness. I have a soul, a deep relationship with the Almighty. And those are my superpowers. I'm going to use them and utilize them to the best of my ability. But together with that, we have to know we have that Moses strain that we also have to turn. We have to make sure that that leads us to humility. To have that humble understanding that yes, we have to have courage to take on whatever it is, but it has to be courageous humility. Make sure it doesn't get to our head.